Thank you very much. For those of you whom I haven't met, my name is Cécile Fabre. I'm a moral and political philosopher here in Oxford, and I will be chairing the first session. Elad has articulated, I think, extremely well that we all owe a debt of gratitude, one way or another, intellectual and personal, to Jeff. It's a huge pleasure for all of us, to be here, for which thanks are owed to Elad. Organizing this conference has been a giant undertaking, many months in the making, and we would not be here were it not for his ceaseless, tireless efforts over the last few months. So on behalf of all of us, let's acknowledge your debt. Thank you. Now, when I asked Jeff earlier this morning, how much speaking time do you want over the course of the day? And in this first session in particular, he said in a firm way, I don't want to speak. Whether he will manage to reframe himself, remains to be seen, but at any rate, I will do my utmost to take him at his word in order to allow as much time as possible for questions from the floor. So the format in this first session will be as follows. Victor Tadros will speak for about 30 minutes, whether he too manages to restrain himself. Also, remains to be seen. This will be followed by a 15-minute or so response by Saba, after which point, we will open the conversation to the floor. I will do my best to take as many questions as possible. This will work if questioners are PC, concise, and direct in their questions, and if responders are equally PC, concise, and direct in their responses. So without further ado, let's have it from Victor. Thank you.
Hello. Nice here. I'm glad Cécile and Elad said nice things about Jeff, because I got nothing. I first met Jeff in about 2009, and we hit it off straight away because of our shared interest in burgers, football, and heavy metal. He invited me to his house, which was really nice. So I was a bit nervous because, he's kind of famous, and I wasn't really much of a philosopher. So, having done this kind of law degree and a bit of Foucault. And so I turn up at his house, I'm thinking, what's going to go on? He picks me up from the airport, and just kind of a mild-mannered guy, but then when he's driving in New Jersey, it all changes, right? So it's like, these fucking bovine morons we're driving along, Jesus. It's all a bit scary. I go to his house, and he got this paper of mine which was about double effect, and we were talking about it a bit. As always with Jeff, when you kind of discuss your work, it's kind of 90% grammar. So I really learned a lot about that. We had a big argument about whether comparator was a word, so I was doing some counterfactuals, and Jeff said that comparator was not a word, and I thought it was a word. Obviously, I'm not going to take this from an American who we know have a kind of micro-proportion of the English language at their fingertips. I was right. Comparator clearly is a word. I looked it up. It turns out that it's a device to change electronic signals. It may be that I didn't use it in a completely appropriate way, but nevertheless, I felt like I'd won. He got very angry about the whole sports metaphor thing. That was, he was like, I used a sports metaphor in the paper, which he thought was not really on. And later on, I told him about the serial killing, and he seemed to mind that less. It was really the sports metaphor that got him. Obviously, Jeff's just an amazing, legitimate comparators to Jeff's outstanding work are hard to find. His arguments almost always hit the bullseye. Given the range of important practical concerns he writes about, the stakes could hardly be higher, and we all hope that he's not quite ready to call full-time on his career. But there's plenty of laurels to rest on already. I know no one who's been more generous with their time and encouraging to others to do their best work, both teammates and opponents. And his support and enthusiasm have helped others to play their best game. So even those who are mainly critical of his views. So a big thanks to Jeff. I owe a huge amount to Jeff, who's been amazing to me, and I know many other people in the room feel the same way. Okay, so let's do a bit of philosophy. So my aim in this paper is to step back from some of the things that Jeff talks about in his work and try and take a bit of an overview about some general theoretical issues that emerge when we think about the range of issues that Jeff's explored together in the round, rather than thinking about particular bits. So it's a bit ambitious and also a bit shit, but we'll see how it goes. So the paper is a bit programmatic. It doesn't really defend particular conclusions, but it rather explores some general questions in moral theory, and it gets us to think through some issues in non-consequentialist ethics against the backdrop of those general questions. Okay, so here's three big questions. What's good? What do we have reason to value most? And what are we required to do? So a familiar way of organizing our thinking about moral theories focuses on the relationship between answers to the first and the third questions. So what is good and what are we required to do? On standard formulations, consequentialist theories are that goodness fully determines what we're required to do, and non-consequentialist theories, in contrast, are that goodness does not fully determine what we're required to do. On standard formulations, act consequentialism, we're always required to do what's best, and on the latter theories, we're sometimes permitted or required to act in a way that is not the best, and Jeff is a star player on the non-consequentialist team. So moral theories differ in their explanations that they give for particular moral duties, reasons, and principles, and we might focus primarily on particular moral principles that explain familiar intuitions that people have defended. For example, non-consequentialists defend agent-relative prerogatives. They defend permissions or duties that are based on properties of the agent. They have defended agent-neutral restrictions on doing what's best, such as various versions of the means principle, the doctrine of doing and allowing, significance of responsibility and liability for permissibility, and they've offered accounts that aim to provide deeper explanations of those particular principles. And again, Jeff is exemplary in this regard, defending and refining familiar non-consequentialist principles such as the doctrine of double effect and the doctrine of doing and allowing. So philosophers have also defended more general theories which are trying to underpin these non-consequentialist thoughts, like Scanlon's contractualism or Kant's categorical imperative might aim to explain our moral judgments in a way that is more general. That's the kind of aim. And then we might think there should be some sort of relationship between morality and value that's also explained by these kinds of general theories. And here's how I'm going to make progress to try and think about that. I'm going to begin with a range of intuitions where there are close analogies between what we're required to do and what we should value. And I'm going to suggest that the relationship between what we're required to do and what we should value when we're not acting are much closer than many people think, intuitively. And then once we get those intuitions going, we're going to see that that's a challenge to the way in which we're thinking about the relationship between goodness, valuing, and betterness. And I'm going to suggest that valuing is itself best understood as a non-consequentialist endeavor, and not just an agent-relative non-consequentialist endeavor, but an agent-neutralist non-consequentialist endeavor. So that's the kind of controversial thing. And there are other implications for thinking in this way too, but I'm not going to draw those out for the sake of time. So I have some views about how this has implications for general moral theory, and I have some views about how it has implications for things like the significance of intentions to permissibility, but I'm going to leave those aside in the talk, but they are part of the larger paper. Okay, so let's start with a bunch of cases which are pretty familiar from the literature where non-consequentialists seem to have the upper hand, at least intuitively, against consequentialists. Self-rescue. So Arno, Bella, and Charlie, these are all on your handout, by the way, which I hope you have in front of you. Arno, Bella, and Charlie are all strangers to each other. They're all drowning. Arno can save himself, or he can save both Bella and Charlie. If he does the former, Bella and Charlie will die. If he does the latter, he will die. So the intuition that many people have in this case is that Arno is both permitted to rescue himself and also permitted to rescue both Bella and Charlie. So he's got like moral latitude. He could do either of those things. But it seems best that Bella and Charlie are rescued, and so the view that says we're always required to do what's best seems like it's challenged by this example because Arno is not required to rescue Bella and Charlie, he's just permitted to do it. Okay, child rescue, we've got 3 children who are drowning. 1 is Arno's child, 2 are Bella's children. Arno can rescue either his child or 2 of Bella's. Intuitively, Arno is permitted to rescue his child, and many also have the intuition that he's required to do so. He mustn't rescue both of Bella's, even though If both of Bella's children are rescued, that seems like it's what's best. Okay, we've got agent-neutral settings, so this is called trolley signal. A trolley's headed down a track towards Bella, who will be killed if nothing is done. Arno can save Bella only by turning the trolley towards Charlie, who will then be killed. Intuitively, if everything's equal between Bella and Charlie, Arno's required not to turn the trolley towards Charlie, but it's no better that Bella's killed than that Charlie's killed, so the intuitive view can't easily be squared by the view that we're always required to do what's best. Now think about bridge, another famous case. A trolley's headed down a track towards 5 people who'll be killed as nothing is done. Arno's on the bridge. The only way he can save the 5 is by pushing Bella from the bridge. Bella's body will stop the trolley if Arno pushes her off, and then she'll be killed, but the 5 will be saved. Intuitively, it's wrong for Arno to kill Bella to save the 5, even though obviously it's best if 5 are saved and 1 dies rather than 1 being saved and 5 dying, or 1 living and 5 dying. And we can kind of get a bit of a firmer grip on the idea that this intuition is not best explained by the doing and allowing kind of case from an emissions variation. In this variation, the trolley's heading down the track towards Bella. She's lying on the track. 5 people are behind Bella further down the line, and now Arno can pull Bella off the track. She's trying to get off, and if he does that, then the 5 will be run over. If he does nothing, then Bella will be killed and the 5 will be saved, but many people think that Bella should be pulled from the track. Okay, now we've got non-consequentialist account of the permissibility of defensive force. Again, obviously, Jeff has been probably the central figure that's been writing about this in the world for the last 20 years or more. No, much more, really. In this case, Bella is about to attack Charlie. If nothing's done, he'll suffer life-altering injuries. Arno can prevent this only by pushing Bella off a cliff. That will kill Bella, but it will save Charlie. But Charlie's only going to suffer life-altering injuries, and let's say he's going to have a life that's better than, that's worth living, even if he suffers the life-altering injuries. So it looks like it's worse if Bella is killed than if Charlie suffers life-altering injuries, and yet it seems permissible for Arno to kill in this case. Okay, now some people, obviously, Shelley's in the room, so maybe you want to have a dessert story about this stuff, and most people who are in the literature think that's not going to work, partly because they might be dessert skeptics like me, but partly because they think that similar intuitions can be drawn in cases where people act permissibly. For example, like risk takers who impose permissible risks on other people look like they sometimes have to bear the costs of those risks, even if things are suboptimal when they bear those costs. So desert isn't going to explain those kinds of variations. Okay, now we've got a couple of cases where it's a bit less clear whether they are best explained in consequentialist or non-consequentialist terms if the intuitions are veridical. So one is lives against headaches. So in this case, Arno can either save Bella's life or save N people from suffering a headache. And most people have the intuition in this case that however large N is, that Arno ought to save Bella's life rather than save N people from headaches. Even if there's 1 billion or 10 billion or whatever, you've always got to save the life rather than the headaches. And then we've got creation or exist, or create or assist. In this case, Arno can either extend Bella's life by 20 years of good life, or they can create a new person, Charlie, who will live for 30 years of good life. And the intuition is that Arno should help Bella, extending her life by 20 years rather than creating a new person who will live for 30 years of good life, but obviously it's better that there are 30 years of good life than there are 20 years of Bella's extended life. Obviously, we've got to hold lots and lots of other stuff equal to get that conclusion, but most people think that the fact that Bella's still in existence makes a difference, and Jeff defends that conclusion in a couple of papers. Okay, so now I want to think about the evaluative analogues of these cases. So these are cases where we're not acting, there's no Arno doing something, there's just an Arno who is watching what's happening. So these cases are exactly the same as our other cases, but they are evaluative cases. So in Self-Rescue 2, so in all these cases I've got the case and then I've got 2, so it's like a kind of like extended movie series where part 2 is less exciting than part 1 because it doesn't have a person who's acting, it's just got a bunch of people who are passively watching stuff, which is always what happens in the sequel to movies. So Arno, Bella and Charlie are all strangers to each other, they're drowning, some flotsam is floating nearby. Arno knows that a gust of wind's about to blow, but he doesn't know whether it's going to blow the flotsam towards him or towards Bella and Charlie. If it's blown towards him, he'll be able to save himself, but he'll be unable to save Bella and Charlie. If it's blown towards Bella and Charlie, then they'll be able to save themselves, but they won't be able to save him. So someone's dying, either it's going to be two people or one person, and Arno can't do anything to make a difference to who's going to live or die in this case. It's all down to the wind and the flotsam, and no one's got control over that. Okay, now I'm going to rely on the idea that we have judgments about what we ought to hope, and that it could be morally wrong to hope for the wrong things, or at least morally criticizable to hope for the wrong things. So, for example, if I hoped that you were all going to suffer horrible, incurable diseases or pain, it would be, I think, morally wrong for me to hope that, and if not morally wrong, at least criticizable for me to hope that you all suffered incurable pain. So I think we have moral intuitions about what we should hope for, as well as moral intuitions about what we should do. Some people think that what's in your mind is just up to you. George Sher wrote a book called The Wild West of the Mind, where what's in the mind is really just up to you. I don't find that too plausible. I think it's at least morally criticizable when people hope for the wrong stuff. Okay, so now what should Arno hope for in this case with the flotsam? I'm going to say he's got the same kind of latitude about hoping that he had about action. It's okay for him to hope that he'll be saved, and it's okay for him to hope that the two will be saved. He's got latitude about hoping, just like he had latitude about action in the action version of the case. Okay, now we've got child rescue, 3 children are drowning, 1 is Arno's child, 2 are Bella's children. Some flotsam's floating nearby again. Arno knows that a gust of wind's about to blow, but he doesn't know whether it's going to blow towards his child, in which case his child will be saved, or towards Bella's 2 children, in which case Bella's 2 children will be saved. I take it that most people think that if it's right that Arno ought to rescue his child, it's also true that he ought to hope that his child should get rescued. That seems like the intuitive view in this case. He doesn't have the kind of latitude that he has in the case involving himself. When it comes to his children, he has to hope that his child's going to get saved, even though that's hoping for what's not best. Okay, in trolley, I'm going to leave aside trolley single 2, actually, for the moment. Because that's the one outlier, I think. Let's talk about bridge 2. So we can already see from the case we just had just now that agent-relative considerations make a difference in valuing. What we have reason to value and what we can be criticized for valuing is an agent-relative matter. And that's relatively familiar in the literature. Derek Parfit has a bit of a discussion of that. Shelley has a bit of a discussion of that in his book. It may not be veridical again. People have challenges to that, but at least the intuition is that we have agent-relative principles that govern valuing. And now let's think about whether there are agent-neutral considerations around valuing which are also non-consequentialist by thinking about bridge 2. So in this case, a trolley's headed down a track towards 5 people who will be killed if nothing's done. It's just like the earlier bridge case, but Bella's on the bridge in this case. Bella's body's large enough to stop the trolley. Arno's watching. He can't do anything, but a boulder is rolling towards Bella. What should Arno hope for? Should he hope that the boulder hits Bella, in which case Bella will be knocked off the bridge, stop the trolley and save the 5? Or should he hope that the boulder doesn't hit Bella, she stays on the bridge and the 5 get killed? Now I think the intuition in this case is just like it is in the action case. I think that the hope should be that the boulder doesn't hit in this case, and that the 5 thereby get killed. I don't think Arno should hope that the boulder hits Bella, knocking her onto the tracks. And I think it's even clearer in the evaluative version of protection, called protection 2. So in that case, Bella's about to attack Charlie, Arno's watching, he can't do anything. If nothing happens, then Charlie's going to suffer life-altering injuries again, but a gust of wind might blow Bella off a cliff, and if that happens, then Bella's going to die at the bottom of the cliff, and Charlie will be saved from suffering life-altering injuries. And I take it that the verdict that Arno should hope that the gust of wind blows Bella off the cliff is even stronger than the analogue verdict in the bridge case. Okay, so these cases suggest that our judgments about valuing, like our judgment about action, have a kind of non-consequentialist flavor. Most of the literature on non-consequentialism has been about action. But when it comes to valuing, people haven't really thought about these cases quite so much, and yet it turns out that our judgments are pretty much accordant between our valuing and our actions, at least in these examples. And now we've got some evaluative intuitions that correspond to our normative intuitions in the cases which I was unsure about whether they were best explained about outcomes or actions, lives versus headaches and create or assist. So in lives versus headaches, some natural event will occur which will either save Bella's life or will prevent N people from suffering headaches. And I take it that Arno should hope that Bella's life is saved rather than N people suffer headaches, however large N is. And that in creation or assist, if Arno's unsure whether a new person with 30 years of good life will be created or whether Bella's life will be extended by 20 years of good life, again, Arno should hope that Bella's life is extended even if he can't do anything about it. So again, we've got these analogues between the action case and the evaluation case across all these examples. The one example where we don't is trolley single. In trolley single, I suggested that it was intuitively wrong for Arno to turn the trolley away from one person towards one other person, but I think that when we watch trolleys go towards people and hit them, we're just indifferent about whether they turn or don't turn through gusts of wind. Who cares exactly how the trolley is going to hit the person, whether it's because of a gust of wind or because of the shape of the tracks or whatever. So there we don't have an analogue, and that's because it's going to be caused the death either way by something, and so there's really nothing to pick here, and so it really is action that's doing the work in trolley single. But that looks like the only case amongst our set where action is doing the work, given that we've got these evaluative analogues which are kind of similar. All right. So that's the intuitive view. Now, of course, these are all just intuitions about cases, and maybe people want to reject them. Maybe not everyone has all of those intuitions. I take it a lot of people are going to have at least a lot of them. I've tested these out on other folk, and mostly they get pretty widely shared amongst the other folk that I've talked to, although that may be because people find me annoying and want to get rid of me pretty quickly by saying, yeah, Tadros, we kind of agree with what you're saying. I get that too. That's all right. That's all I need. Okay, so now I'm going to think about a kind of sense of betterness. So Derek Parfit has this account of betterness, where you might think we can explain these cases using this account of betterness. So Derek Parfit's account goes like this. It's called the impartial reason implying sense of betterness. And it says between two events, one is better than the other, where everyone would have, from an impartial point of view, stronger reasons to want this event to occur or to hope it will. Okay, so that's a famous account of betterness, famous made by Jeff, who has quoted it, and Jeff also agrees with this. He says, one might argue that a merely evaluative claim doesn't entail normative claims. To be better from an impartial point of view, without there being any reason to prefer it or cause it to occur, instead of the less good outcome, is a possibility, but I don't see how this could be. So my use of good is in the reason implying sense. So he endorses Derek's version of betterness. Now, you might think that that's going to explain our cases, because you might think, look, if you think it's good, if you think that the right thing to value in the bridge 2 case is that the boulder doesn't hit Bella and knock her off, then it's better that that occurs. That's the better event, the one that the boulder doesn't hit Bella knocking her off. And so this version of betterness is going to give us the right kind of verdict. But I don't think that's going to tell us the deeper story about the relationship between goodness, valuing, and morality that we should want here. Go back to the debate in action, where the debate is between consequentialists and non-consequentialists, where non-consequentialists say consequences aren't the thing that's explaining what's going on in cases like Bridge, and non-consequentialists look like they have the intuitive view here, and consequentialists say, yeah, but it's just better that the 5 get saved, and that seems right. That's where the debate is. Better in the more important sense of maximizing the good. Now, there might be some kind of betterness sense where, if the non-consequentialists are right, it's then better that people abide by their moral duties. But nevertheless, the deeper point is that there's a dispute here between consequentialists and non-consequentialists, where everyone acknowledges that good is maximized if Bella is thrown from the bridge, but that ought not to happen if you're a non-consequentialist, and it ought to happen if you're a consequentialist. That's where the debate is. And that also seems like it accords with our judgment about ex-ante versions of the bridge case. So here's one from Casper Hare, where what you get is loads of people in suitcases. No one knows where they're going to be. Someone's going to end up on the bridge in the suitcase. The suitcase is going to get then thrown off and save the 5. And it looks like everyone has an ex-ante interest in the suitcase being thrown off, saving the 5, even if they don't know they're going to be in the suitcase on the bridge or one of the 5. But that would be hard to explain if it was better in the maximizing the good sense if people were thrown off bridges. Okay, so it looks like if people weren't thrown off bridges, rather. So here's the argument a bit more precisely. In bridge, Arno ought not throw Bella in front of the trolley, even though doing so maximizes the good. If Arno does not maximize the good in bridge, the good's not maximized if Bella is not toppled in front of the trolley in bridge 2. Sorry, this argument's on your handout somewhere. Is it? I think. Maybe on the last page. Yeah. As an impartial person, Arno has good reason to value Bella not being toppled in front of the trolley compared with her being blown in front of the trolley. Therefore, Arno has good reason to value an event that does not maximize the good over an event that maximizes the good. Therefore, an impartial person does not always have reason to value an event that maximizes the good over an event that does not maximize the good. Okay, so this doesn't suggest that the reason implying sense of betterness is false. It implies that the reason implying sense of betterness doesn't tell us the most important thing about what's going on. What's going on is that there's a sense of betterness that accords with our judgments about valuing, and those judgments about valuing are not going to coincide precisely with whether the good is maximized. And many people who write about axiology, I think, make the assumption that there's a close relationship between what impartial people have reason to value and what is best. But I'm saying that turns out to be false. It turns out that the norms of valuing are themselves non-consequentialist. And now when we start to think about the lives and headaches and creation or assist cases, we have a new way of thinking about those cases too. One way of thinking about those cases is that the good gets maximized in those cases, and that I think has been the typical way in which people have thought about them. But now we've got a dilemma. Is it true in lives versus headaches that if the life is saved but billions of people suffer headaches, that the good is maximized? Or alternatively, is the right view that we ought to value the saving of the life even though that doesn't maximize the good, just like we ought to value Bella not being killed in the bridge case even though that doesn't maximize the good? And I find it more intuitive that the good is maximized in the case where if there are sufficient numbers of headaches being saved, the headaches are prevented. Because I think it's like a simple math thing. So like a headache's got a certain amount of value, a life has a certain amount of value, you add up all the values of all the headaches, and eventually they're going to be larger, that value, than the value of the life. And so eventually you're going to get the conclusion, I think, that the good is maximized if you prevent sufficient numbers of headaches. I think that's the right conclusion about that case. And you need some really fancy stuff about goodness, I think, to get you a different conclusion. But when it comes to valuing, we've already seen that our norms of valuing are kind of complex. They're not so straightforward as that. They don't just track whether the good's maximized, they track all sorts of other things. They do it in a kind of non-consequentialist way. So when it comes to an evaluation of what we ought to value, maybe we ought to value the saving of the life rather than the valuing of the saving of n number of headaches, however large n is, regardless of the fact that at some point we're going to value something that doesn't maximize the good. And I think the same thing in creation or assist. In that case, I think if the life is created that's got longer amount of good life than the extension of the person's life, the good is maximized, but we might owe it to people who are in existence to extend their lives. And that gives us an explanation of why, even though the good is not maximized in that case, nevertheless, we ought to value the extension of the person's life. We owe it to them not only to do things for them, but to hope things for them because they're in existence. Or maybe if they're necessarily going to come into existence, obviously there's a lot of dispute about those cases which we can leave aside. So when we think about people in existence or who are going to come into existence, we have hopes about those people which are responsive to the fact that they're in existence or perhaps are necessarily going to come into existence. And that's just not true in cases of people who don't exist. We don't yet have hopes for those people. We might hope that they come into existence, but we don't have hopes for those people. And so we have a kind of non-consequentialist story, I think, about creation or assist as well. Okay, so I suggest that rather than just having these two things like axiology and deontology, kind of the morality of action and the morality of valuing, that we have this new thing. Now, obviously, my ancient Greek is amazing. And so I had to, although it is amazing, I had to look up what the ancient Greek for good was. Embarrassing though that is. State school education in England in the 1980s didn't teach me that. It's kalos, apparently, so we could call it kaliology. So we've got the study of goodness, which is kaliology, we've got the study of valuing, which is axiology, and we've got the study of morality, which the morality of action, which is deontology, and now we've got this three-part distinction, and we should try and explore the relationship between those things. And then later on, in further work, when I'm smarter than I am now, I'll try and work out what all that means for moral theory, and that's the end of the story.
So I found Victor's arguments that there are non-consequentialist agent-neutral modes of evaluation pretty compelling. And I'm going to focus almost exclusively on one of his examples, on Bridge 2, and I'm going to end by saying some things about his account of betterness. So in Bridge 2, no one violates any non-consequentialist principles, such as a duty not to use other people as a means, or a duty not to refrain from acting on bad intentions. And no one violates these principles because there isn't any wrongdoer there in the first place. There's no antagonist. The victim isn't used as a mere means because the victim isn't pushed by anyone or mistreated by anyone. It's just a boulder that causes Bella's fall. And yet, Victor says, we should hope that the boulder misses Bella. And this suggests that there are non-consequentialist norms of valuing over and above non-consequentialist principles of conduct. So a quick point about intuitions here. Victor says intuitively we should hope that the boulder doesn't topple Bella. Now, my immediate reaction, admittedly, was the opposite, that we should hope the boulder strikes her. I mean, it maximizes the good and no one's violating any duties. Win-win. Now, of course, consequentialists will say this is bizarre, that we should hope for an outcome we're not allowed or no one is allowed to bring about. But I take it to be characteristic of non-consequentialists that they evaluate agentially induced outcomes differently from non-agentially induced outcomes. But still, maybe my intuition that we should hope the boulder strikes Bella is theory-laden. And I'm sure many will share Victor's contrary intuitions. And in any case, the intuition that I have, even if others share it, certainly doesn't warrant dismissing out of hand the possibility of non-consequentialist modes of valuing, non-consequentialist agent-neutral modes of valuing. So let's just assume Victor is correct in thinking that we should hope the boulder misses Bella. Now, I want to say, this is going to be super sketchy and a bit revisionary, that there might indeed be a violation of non-consequentialist principles in Bridge 2. Now, it's contrary to appearances. Now, it's clearly true that Bella isn't used as a mere means. Although that's clearly true, it might nonetheless be said that her death was useful to the five on the train track. They benefited from her death. And it might be, in certain cases, that there's an enforceable moral prohibition on benefiting from the bad brute luck of others. Now, this is only going to be in certain cases because obviously there will be many instances in which we are allowed to benefit from the bad brute luck of others, such as a self-defense case where Bella is the aggressor who falls off the cliff, as well as in a host of ordinary everyday cases, such as organ donation cases, or when a tornado takes out a neighboring business competing with yours, or when a surgeon is hired for their services. We all benefit from the bad brute luck of others. But I suspect that there's a host of background conditions that explain why these forms of benefiting from the bad luck of others are acceptable. So suppose that there are cases where benefiting usefully from the bad luck of others is unacceptable. And suppose that we can spell out these conditions. And suppose that Bridge 2 is one of them. So a host of promissory notes here. Now, the five victims on the railroad track in Bridge 2 can't discharge this postulated duty to refrain from benefiting from Bella's useful death. The benefit just falls on them like manna from heaven. The five can't discharge this duty in their own person, but maybe we should do so on their behalf by preventing Bella's death. And in our absence, perhaps we can hope for that outcome. So if something like this is right, it shows that there might be an antagonist in Bridge 2 after all. It's the 5 at the bottom of the railroad track. And this is obscured by the fact that they're not culpable, and they're not even acting. And in that respect, they might be akin to the falling man in the well. Now, of course, unlike the falling man, the 5 on the railroad track aren't even causing Bella's demise, but they shouldn't be usefully benefiting from it either, maybe, or so I'm suggesting. And maybe this duty is enforceable. But whereas the falling man might be liable to be preventively killed, I'm claiming something else might be true of the 5. They might be liable to the lethal side effects of saving Bella. And this is to prevent them from usefully benefiting from her bad brute luck. Now, this sketchy suggestion is going to immediately raise a few worries. One of them is that it might be pointed out that the 5 are also victims of bad brute luck. It's not just Bella. But Bella isn't benefiting from the 5's bad brute luck, whereas they are benefiting from Bella's bad brute luck. So there's an asymmetry here. In a standard trolley case with, it's just the regular switch, each of the 5 benefit from the fact that they are on that side of the track, but they don't benefit from the one's death or from the use of their body. Another worry is that, okay, maybe the 5 are liable to something as a result of some deprivations as a result of benefiting from Bella's bad brute luck, but liability to a lethal side effect, that seems like a bridge too far. But there are 2 further points worth considering when thinking about the liability of the 5, which might allay some of the worries here. First, am I saying that the 5 are liable to be killed? Well, that depends on what you think about double prevention cases, which seems to characterize Bella's case. And even then, maybe they're liable only to a less severe harm, and something like a combined or hybrid justification of the kind that McMahan postulates might warrant their deaths as a side effect of saving Bella. And second worry is that, a second consideration is that it's not simply that the 5 benefit from Bella's bad brute luck. In addition, the harm from which they benefit comes about in a way subjecting Bella to a particular causal structure of the sort explained by Francis Cam, and which Victor mentions in the full version of his paper. And this might serve as an aggravating or exacerbating property when it comes to the 5's liability. And it has the felicitous benefit of introducing a symmetry in the explanations as to why it's impermissible to push Bella and why it's impermissible to benefit from Bella being shoved by the boulder. They both impose the same causal structure, or impose upon Bella the same causal role. And there's still other worries. If it's so important that the 5 don't benefit from Bella's bad brute luck, and it turns out that they survive because of it, does this mean that we can just shoot the 5 in the head afterwards? Because, hey, that's one way to make sure they don't benefit. And if it's so important not to benefit, does this mean that their deaths are warranted as a side effect, no matter how many they might be, 5, 50, 500 of them down there on the track? I think there are responses to these challenges, but they'll take us too far afield. Instead, the point here is to emphasize that, ironically, it might be Victor's own arguments from his earlier work which might help locate an antagonist in this case after all, namely his work on enforceable duties as a basis for liability. If that work is paired with an appropriately specified prohibition on benefiting from the bad brute luck of others within, appropriately specified, then we might have a way of locating an antagonist. So where does this leave us? If I'm right in thinking that there's a violation of a non-consequentialist principle here after all, against benefiting usefully from the bad brute luck of others, then we have a different diagnosis of the basis for the cited hope in the example. We hope that the boulder doesn't push Bella onto the tracks. Victor concludes that this is because we have a non-consequentialist reason to value a worse outcome, even absent the violation of any non-consequentialist duties. But if I'm right, we have a non-consequentialist reason to value a worse outcome because there was a violation of an enforceable duty. And this would vindicate the orthodox view that the dispute between consequentialist and non-consequentialist about bridge is best understood, or bridge 2, is best understood as a dispute about suboptimal duties. Now, to be clear, the point I'm making here about benefiting is pretty revisionary, and it just goes to show how far afield I have to go in order to save the orthodox account. And even if I'm right and Victor is wrong, which is not a safe bet in general, what I found to be one of his most interesting arguments still goes through. And this has to do with his 2 ways of understanding better. So I'm going to slightly reframe what Victor is doing in a way that I hope is salutary, which helped me wrap my mind around it more easily. So there are, broadly speaking, two ways of making sense of non-consequentialist principles. And I'll focus here on agent relative duties rather than prerogatives, just to keep things simple. Two ways of making sense of non-consequentialist agent relative duties. On the first method, you do an ordered ranking of all the options available to you. And the ranking is done impartially without reference to non-consequentialist principles. The non-consequentialist then says that the first option is prohibited. The highest ranked option is prohibited since it violates a right of some sort, or it violates a non-consequentialist principle or something like that. So in this case, morality requires you to act suboptimally. So that's one method of making sense of better. On the second method, we also do a ranking. We do a ranking of the options available to us from best to worst. But here, we fold the non-consequentialist principles into the evaluation of each option, yielding a new ranking. So then you always do what's number one on the list. You never not do what's number one. And this is what's come to be known as a consequentializing strategy, where you do your axiology by taking into consideration non-consequentialist principles, the value of which determines the ordered ranking. Now, when Victor throughout talks about one option being more perspicuous than the other, or one notion of better being different from the other, what I take him to be saying is that he prefers the first method of the ranking rather than the second. Where in the first ranking, you refrain from consequentializing, and the second method, you consequentialize. And Victor prefers the non-consequentializing option since he thinks it's unobvious that violating non-consequentialist principles makes anyone worse off. In which case, there's no basis for construing the constraint in terms of a value. And if that's true, then we can't reorder the ranking with non-consequentialist principles folded into each option. And this vindicates what he calls the more perspicuous reading of non-consequentialist principles. Now, I don't think that anything I've said about Bella and benefiting from bad brute luck, etc., none of that undermines Victor's reasons for thinking that the consequentializing method is wrong-headed. Indeed, when he says it's less perspicuous, I think that he understates what he might be showing here. The consequentializing method functions by, as I mentioned, by folding non-consequentialist principles into an ordered axiological ranking of the options that you have. The thought here is that there's an agent-relative sense in which violating a consequentialist principle makes things axiologically worse. And consequentializers will often advert to agent-relative value in order to make sense of this. But Victor has argued that it's unclear where this value is supposed to go. In cases like Bridge, where Bella is wronged, and this comes from the full length of the paper, in cases like Bridge, where Bella is wronged, Victor denies that the wrong itself makes her worse off. And he points out it doesn't make anyone else worse off either. He denies out of hand that the wrong might be impartially bad, though I think some consequentializers might be attracted to this view that there's something to the claim that the world in which violations of non-consequentialist duties occur is a worse world. But putting that aside, if Victor is right in suggesting that there's nowhere for us to put the value, then this seems to vindicate his contention that what he calls the more perspicuous understanding of the relationship between consequentialism and non-consequentialism is the right one. And this argument would remain sound even if it's correct what I've said about the possibility of a hidden antagonist in cases like Bridge 2. And I find this super interesting because I always thought, like up until reading Victor's paper, I always thought the dispute between consequentializers and their opponents amounts to just a notational difference. I always thought that the two different ways of doing those rankings amount to the same theory just formalized in different ways. And that a lot of ink has been spilt over nothing here. All these papers written on consequentializing, that it just doesn't really amount to anything, this notational difference. But if Victor is right, there actually is a substantive difference between these meta-normative theories. And the funny thing is that this is a substantive upshot of the paper, even if his primary contention about a non-consequentialist impartial basis for normative evaluation is wrong. And this is just characteristic of Victor and McMahon's writings, that even if the thesis is wrong, which is a big if, even if what he says is wrong, it still potentially changes the field. That's it.
Thanks. That was super clever and typical Victor Saba fashion. Really quickly, though, there's another way of explaining why there's a symmetry between the reactions in the cases, which has to do with this, which what I take to be a heuristic way of getting at the good, which is what we should or what we're permitted to hope for. And that is that hope is very close to intend. I mean, they're not the same, of course, but one might explain the intuitions by saying, yeah, I mean, there's a non-consequentialist, maybe there's a non-consequentialist restriction on, intending certain things, and that bleeds over into, hoping, and then because intending and hoping are so similar, it's not a surprise then that there would be, this kind of similarity. Maybe what you're actually telling us, instead of telling us something about the good, I mean, this is devil's advocate, you're really, or some other way of, something about valuing, you're really telling us about another sort of non-consequentialist principle that has to do with what we should or shouldn't hope for, that's similar to the, what we should or shouldn't intend.
Terrific. So that's one way to go, is to say, look, so in the full version of the paper, I use hope really as a kind of way of getting a better grip of the more abstract idea of what we have most reason to value between options. So let's just use hoping as a simple idea of kind of capturing the more complex thought of what we have most reason to value. My intuitions about what we have most reason to value just track in these cases. But again, maybe that's not true for everyone. Maybe some people's hopes and what they have reason to value, maybe they think those things come apart. I find it hard to get my head around the idea that they could really come apart. But then one possibility is that what we have most reason to value just tracks what we ought to do for the kinds of reasons that you offer. Maybe we have like a theory of hope, a kind of disposition about hoping, which then generates the right actions in the right circumstances, and that explains why we hope. That's one way you could go with it. Say this is all just derivative. That's one explanation of why we would get non-consequentialism in a theory of value. I don't think myself that it's the best one, because I think there are some cases where what we have reason to hope for and what we ought to do clearly come apart. So, for example, I'm on an employment committee, there's a bunch of candidates, my kid is one of the candidates, I have good reason to hope that they get the job, but I have a good reason not to give them the job if they're not the best qualified candidate. So there's a bunch of cases like that, I think, where we should hope for an outcome, but that shouldn't guide our conduct. And I think that's actually reasonably common, that we should set aside some agent relative considerations when deciding what to do. And if this heuristic thing was right, it would guide us in the wrong way in those cases.
Thank you.
Right. So when you mentioned that you think we have reason to hope that the boulder not push the person off the bridge, that's where I got off the boat. I said, well, actually, I do actually hope that the boulder knocked the person off. And I think other people might share that intuition. But then in reflecting further, it occurred to me, well, even if I hope that, I certainly don't hope it as strongly as I hope that the wind blow a trolley that's headed towards 5 onto 1. And that's probably all you need. I mean, and I think one thing that is going on is that one of the reasons why we think it's bad that someone be used as a means is because we think it's bad for people to be treated in this exploitative fashion. But above and beyond that, we think there's something amiss with sort of natural causes being instrumental in that way. And that's really all you need to carve out this third category of valuing as opposed to goodness, as opposed to deontology. So you don't need to rely on that controversial intuition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, like, I agree that the Bridge 2 case is a bit more disputed. As I say, I mean, I talked to a lot of people. Some people say yes, some people say no about that case. It's a bit of an intuitive split. The reason why I use that case is it's the clearest one in the non-consequentialist literature in action, and it's simple. The one that's really clearly intuitively very powerful are the protection cases. where in that case, almost everyone hopes that the aggressor is going to fall off the cliff, even though that's not best. So in the kind of liability versions, I think you get very, very clear intuitions. In the bridge case, you get slightly less clear intuitions, I think, is the kind of standard I've found from talking to people about these sorts of cases. But you're right to say also that you don't need anything as strong as that in order for us to want to think that a theory of the good and the theory of valuing should come apart. All you need is a difference. You don't need the difference to be decisive. Maybe you could just change the numbers and you're going to get decisive differences in the outcomes, but you don't even need that. That's right. Thanks, helpful.
Thank you. Victor, I was just wondering what you think about how the fact that hope doesn't seem to be constrained by compatibility. There's a kind of closeness problem, right? It seems to me I can hope that the boulder doesn't hit what's-her-face, and also that I can hope that the five are saved. And so and it seems a bit odd for me not to hope both of those things, to my mind anyway. So I'm not hoping that the boulder hits anybody. I'm not hoping that anybody dies. In the self-rescue, I'm hoping I get saved, but I'm also hoping the other people get saved. So that seems to me to make it less reliable as a... I mean, it does seem to diverge from best outcomes in the way that you say, but it's not clear to me that it's a good guide to what we have most reason to value, because that doesn't look like it is compatible with, valuing impossible things doesn't seem much use axiologically or in any case, I suppose. So I'm not sure what we would do with that category if impossible things were the things we had most reason to value and so forth. So there's a kind of closeness problem, and I suppose there's also a problem of intentionality, which is related, because I don't think you're making much of the fact that I can hope that I save myself. That's okay, but I can't hope that the others die, right? That's not the way I should hope, even though that's implied by my being saved.
So you can form hopes between constrained sets of options, or you can have this unconstrained thing. But the unconstrained thing is really weird. So if I say, look, I really hope I live to 100, so what are you hoping for that for? You could go for 110 or 1,000 or much, much longer. But it's like, yeah, but 100 is kind of in the ballpark of where, it's like at the kind of good end of like of what seems kind of likely at the moment. So it's like we hope against constrained options. Now, what I was hoping to capture in these cases was the idea that we know that one of two outcomes is going to occur. And then we think, what do we hope between the two outcomes where we know that one of the two of them is going to occur? So that's a way in which we should go constrained. Then when you say, oh, but what we really hope for is this third thing, I'm like, yeah, but we know one of these two things is going to occur, and that's a natural way of constraining our judgments between the two outcomes and excluding alternatives.
Hi, thanks. I was interested in this feature at the argument at the end, which uses this phrase, maximizes the good. And to me, that phrase seems kind of ambiguous. Like the default reading I would take as there's some good stuff, and what maximizes the good is what leads to the most good stuff. So it's a kind of aggregative meaning. It's the greatest amount of the good. And then there's another reading where it's just better. And I wondered if this argument at the end has some risk of equivocating between those senses, where the sense in which premises 1 and 2 are most plausible is the amount of good sense. And the sense that's relevant to, say, Parfit's definition of better is the sense where it just means better. And so thinking about your cases, for example, so I share the intuition about the protection cases, for example, very strongly. Like, you should hope that the aggressor fall off the cliff. Is that the case, right? Yeah. But I also think, like, intuitively it's better if that happens. That's the... but it doesn't maximize the amount of good stuff if that happens. So yeah, I was just wondering why you switched to this phrase towards the end of maximizing the good, and if you think the argument's just as compelling when you just say better.
Well, so the idea is something like this, that when we make the judgment about what's better between two options, we might have already incorporated earlier non-consequentialist judgments about valuing. And so then the judgments about betterness, which use Parfit's sense of better, are the implications of an earlier set of assessments that we make, which are non-consequentialist in nature. And we have the same thing about action. So when we say, like, well, if it's wrong to throw Bella from the from the bridge in order to save the 5, it's also better not to do it. when we use the language of betterness there, it's just the outcome of this earlier dispute between consequentialists and non-consequentialists, and whatever the outcome of that dispute is going to tell us what's better in this sense. Now, I'm not saying at all that there's anything wrong with Parfit's sense of betterness. It's fine, and it's actually the one that I think captures intuitions about these cases, so I agree that it is better that the wrongdoer falls from the cliff. But then I think that sense of betterness doesn't capture maximizes the good, and that's why we need these two different thoughts. One thought which says, what's good? And then from that, what constraints there are on what we should value as a result of that, in virtue of which one outcome is going to then be better than the other in Parfit's sense.
Thanks, that's very helpful. But I didn't understand why we need the what's good in the maximizing good amount of stuff sense at all, as opposed to just
It's just like we could have a consequentialist against non-consequentialist debate about valuing, just like we could have a consequentialist versus non-consequentialist debate about action. And it's really important to be able to have that debate in clear terms. So if we build all of this non-consequentialist stuff about valuing into our account of goodness, we then don't have a way of capturing this dispute and then finding theoretical tools to resolve it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. Love the talk. I have two quick comments. I'll make them very quick. I suggest that you think not just about the case of hope, but also the case of remorse or regret. Because I think there's two different issues here. There's an ex-ante approach to some of these issues, and there's an ex-post. Ex-ante, I might think, well, I hope the boulder doesn't hit that guy. But when I think about regret or remorse, I'll have more remorse if 5 people have died than if 1 have died. And I think that will apply to many, though not all of your cases. One of the things that tells me is that we have to be a pluralist. There are lots of different sources of value. You're tapping into one, and I think it's very important. It's worth emphasizing, but it doesn't mean the other sources of values don't exist and aren't also very important, maybe equally important. So that's the first comment. And the second comment echoes Jake Niebel's right there, and that's that I think that the maximizing is ambiguous. We can agree that there's lots of total bits of utility, but we might be, some of us, anti-additive aggregationists and think that those total bits don't sum up to make a greater sum. So we think the total is less than the sum of its individual parts. And the ambiguity he's worried about is that you're running those two together when you talk about maximizing the good. Well, obviously there's more good, you say, because there's so many more individual parts. But if you're an anti-additive aggregationist, you think that doesn't follow.
So let me take the second thing. So on the second thing, my thought was, look, you're right, there's two ways we could go here. We could think, when we think about the Lives Against Headaches case, one view is that the good is greater if the life gets saved because the good is greater than the sum of the parts. An alternative way of going is to say that the good is non-maximized, but the norms of valuing mean we should favor the life getting saved. So that was the dispute between these two different views that we could have about the case. And then my thought was, it's more plausible that the second thing is true than the first, because we already know that our norms of valuing are complex and non-consequentialist from other cases. And then we've got this really simple account which just says the good is the total of the sum of the parts, but how we should respond to that fact is a complex matter, and we already know that from cases like Bridge 2 and the self-defense kinds of cases. Why go down this complex route which says the good is so complicated when we already are confident that valuing is complicated? So that was the kind of argument in favor of the second view. Now, I'm not saying that's a decisive argument. It may turn out that it's really the good that's the complex thing. This is really just to illuminate that there's a dispute between these things which we can clarify once we get these two different ways of thinking about the problem, and then we can try and make progress. And then there's a question about the people who think that the good is greater than the sum of the parts. How we make assessments about that when we can't use intuitions about valuing because we know that a valuing is non-consequentialist. And it's a really tricky question about how you actually can make progress with giving clear verdicts about the good is greater than sum of the parts once we recognize that we don't have these tools which we've been using, which are tools about valuing, to do the job, because those tools about valuing might turn out to have non-consequentialist features.
Thank you. Kida, over to you.
Hiya. Thanks, Victor. Great talk. So my question is, I have another case where it seems like the valuing part comes apart from what you're morally required to do, and it's not clear to me what the explanation is going to be. So it's unlike Charlie single. So I want to see what you think. So it's I would call it a self-rescue 3. In this case, again, it's Arnold versus Bella and Charlie, and Arnold can act. So there's a floating lifesaver. Arnold is going to go and grab the lifesaver, and it's not about what Arnold will hope, but what Donna will hope. So it seems like in this case, I would think that it's probably you want to hope, if you're an impartial person, you hope that Arnold doesn't succeed, because then suppose if Arnold doesn't succeed, the lifesaver will float to the 2 and 2 people get saved. So I think you probably hope that Arnold doesn't succeed, even though at the same time, if you can act to prevent Arnold from taking the lifesaver, it might be impermissible for you to intervene, given that Arnold has a prerogative to take it for himself. So I'm not sure about that, but it seems like there is another case where the two comes apart. The case where you hope that someone doesn't act on their agent prerogative, but you can't act to prevent them.
In this example, the lifesaver belongs to Arno. Is that right?
No, it doesn't belong to anyone.
It doesn't belong to anyone.
Yeah.
So if it doesn't belong to anyone, then I'm tempted to say Arno shouldn't take it, and it should, they should leave it to float off to the 2. But in the case where Arno owns the lifesaver and has bought it in order to save his life in just these kinds of circumstances, then I think Arno's permitted to take it, assuming background equality or something like that, some kind of walk-in fair resources or something that sits in the background. Then I'm tempted to say that he's entitled to take it. And in that case, maybe I think we also hope that he succeeds. And I'm not quite sure about that. Maybe you're right to say, even in that version of the case, we hope that he doesn't succeed and that the lifesaver goes off and saves the 2. It's really unclear what to say about that case. Really an interesting case. Yeah, let me think about it some more.
Yeah, so this is about valuing and hoping. So I'm a bit confused about valuing. So, I hadn't thought a lot about it before I came into this room. But before I came into this room, I would have thought it was something to do with, that there's kind of deontology over here. There's, actions. And then we've got valuing over here, which is opinions or something like that. And then to bring out what we should value or not value in these cases, you put in hoping, presumably because we've got firmer intuitions about hoping than we do about valuing, because what is valuing is unclear. But then that has the effect of bringing valuing, so this is the kind of question. It kind of your talk left me with the thought that valuing is like deontology of the mind. It's like what kind of mental acts we should perform. So is that really true? And then that left me with the question, aren't there cases where hoping and valuing come apart? And I was trying to think of a case, and then you provided one, I think, which is when you were trying to distinguish acting and hoping. You gave the job interview case, so you're hoping that your child gets the job, even though it'd be wrong for you to, and it's permissible for you to hope, but it'd be wrong for you to act to ensure your child gets the job. And then that case, to the extent that I've got any intuitions about valuing, that seemed to be a case where, it would be strange to value that your child gets the job, while it's natural that you hope that your child gets the job.
Yeah, I don't know what to think about that. I mean, I'm tempted to think you would value your child getting the job as well. I mean, the cases where your kids get something unfair, you can value that sometimes, I think, as well. So it's really clear when the stakes are even higher. So I'm the captain on a ship's going down, not enough places on the lifeboat for everyone. It's fair for me to draw lots. Let's suppose that I'm not allowed to favour my kid because I'm in this public role or whatever. So I draw lots, my kid doesn't get a spot. And then some wrongdoer might push someone out and put my kid in place of someone who fairly got the spot. So I hope that happens, and I value it happening, even though it's wrong for it to happen. And so there's a case where I think valuing and hoping kind of line up. I value the outcome where my kid gets saved, despite all of the fact that it's wrong and unfair and so on, that they get saved in this way. And I tend to think the same thing about the job case, that I could value my kid getting the job even though they're not the best candidate.
Thanks. So I was just thinking about what a consequentialist who likes the impartial reason implying sense of betterness and wants to say that the outcome that's better in that sense is the outcome that maximizes the good, would say in response to your talks. It wants to keep those two things together instead of driving them apart. And I think one thing they could say is this a kind of a tripart response. So you've offered a bunch of cases. Some of the cases you've offered are just not good test cases for determining whether the outcome that's better in the impartial reason implying sense is the outcome that maximizes the good. Some of your cases are those in which, I'll explain this in a second. Some of your cases are those in which we can just deny the intuition about which outcome you ought to hope obtains, like Mike was saying. And some of the cases are cases in which the outcome that you describe as being the one that has more good really aren't. They're not the outcome that has more good. So I'll give some examples. So I take it that your self-rescue 2 and child rescue 2 just aren't good test cases for determining whether the outcome that we should hope obtains, or the event that we should hope obtains, is the one that maximizes the good. And that's because the impartial reason implying sense says between two events, or I would say outcomes, one's better than the other, where everyone would have, from an impartial point of view, stronger reasons to want this event to occur. So from an impartial point of view is important there. I take it that in self-rescue 2 and in child rescue 2, I shouldn't be impartial in those. It's precisely because it's my child, right? And if I really could bring myself to adopt an impartial point of view, I might hope that the outcome where more children are saved would obtain, right? Now let's go to your create or assist 2, which I thought was one of your most interesting cases. Right, where Arno's unsure whether a person with 30 years of good life will be created or whether Bella's life will be extended by 20 years, right? Can't do anything to influence it. And it seems like the outcome where someone is created with 30 years is the one that has more good. But I think it's open to the consequentialist to say that actually the outcome where the other person's life is extended by 20 years has more good, because each year of life could be weighted more precisely because it's an extension of a person's life, right? I'm not saying that's plausible, but it's open right, to the person. And then in the case of the liable attacker, I think it's open to someone to say that the liable attacker being thrown off the cliff, well, that's actually better in a sense. Now, maybe that's not very plausible, and I think that's your best case, the liable attacker. But anyway, that's a lot, but...
Yeah, no, I agree. But as always, consequentialists have moves, right? I mean, it's like, no shock there in one way. It's like just like in the non-consequentialist issue, there's a bunch of stuff to say, both about whether in some cases the verdicts that seem like it's not the better one are in fact better ones, or to deny intuitions or debunk them and all sorts of things. This is just to try and say, here's a way of setting up this problem. Here's our initial set of intuitions about it. This is why we should distinguish between these three kind of ways of assessing outcomes. And then we can get into the weeds, and think, okay, so what moves have we got here for people who are consequentialists who really want to preserve the maximizing the good sense and who think that the maximal good is the one where the whole is just the sum of the parts. What should we say if we're that kind of person? What kind of moves do we have available? And, I think things, as you were almost hinting yourself, things get pretty ugly pretty quickly, but, that's not to say, consequentialists have been happy over the years that things get ugly pretty quickly and trying to make some moves here. And so, I'm not saying we're going to close off the debate this way, but in some of these cases, it looks really powerful. Create and assist, I think, for example, is a really powerful case where the idea that, that a life is better because it's an extension is just a weird idea. But, possibly.
Thanks. This is a kind of outsider point. You've asked us to think about our intuitions about scenarios, and listening to them, I wonder if you even mean the same as I do by child. If you can talk so lightly about pushing children off bridges and under boulders, and that's not, for me, that's not a trivial thing, because you're asking about my intuitions. If I think about a child, I don't think of them as a counter in a game.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, that is, so like, philosophy's gone this way, and so people like me...
That's no excuse.
That's no excuse. I mean, maybe it isn't, but maybe it is. So, like, we've become very casual, in the literature about talking about the way in which people get affected in some serious ways.
We is a very dangerous... Sorry, I won't keep interrupting you, but we is a very dangerous word to use.
We, as in, like, the people who are working in analytic philosophy on these questions in publishing in it and so on, I think have become pretty kind of, like, casual about thinking in those terms. And that's turned out, I think, to be really a good thing, in that a lot of progress has been made in distinguishing between cases. We have strong intuitions in these cases without having to get all kind of wrought up about, like, the cases by thinking about the real world problems. And, when people like really kind of like think, oh yeah, but there's a real person here, and then there's other real people here, and then we have to think about the real people against the other real people, and get all kind of like, angsty about it. It's like, it's kind of unhelpful to get into all that angst, because when we did all that, it didn't make any difference. Because we did do all that, and then it didn't really help, and so we stopped doing it.
I wasn't talking about a specific child, I mean a child.
I mean, like I say, you get this a lot, when you kind of do this stuff, like, oh, you're really trivializing, but I kind of like, well, did it really make a difference to the way in which we thought about morality that we didn't trivialize? And we really thought about the real individuals and how they were affected? And the answer was no, we had all the same verdicts when we did that, so we stopped doing it because it was also such hard work. And so emotionally exhausting, that you had to kind of think through all this stuff in this kind of like more, but there's a real person that's going to get hurt or die or whatever, When we started doing that, it was like, it was all so kind of like upsetting, and we didn't get any better results. It was all the same results with the same disputes.
Thank you. I'm going to go right back to pushing people off bridges. So,
in a happy way. I can see it.
So I think I'm wondering how the account might extend to cases where we're hoping not something about what will happen, but what another person might do. So if I'm a third party and I'm watching the two bridge cases, and I hope that the boulder will hit Bella, then if I am a non-consequentialist, can I also hope in the first case that Arno, if I don't know who Arno is, that Arno happens to be a consequentialist and will push the person off the bridge?
Yeah, good. So in the longer paper, I kind of discussed that a little bit. There's like two different kinds of axiological cases we can have. We have axiological cases where we build in actions into what's happening and you're watching the actions occur. And then we can think about what our judgments are about how we value other people's actions. Or we can have natural events. And I set aside the first set of cases, although they're really interesting. So some people might have like intuitions about like deontic value that Parfit talks about. Larry talks about it a bit in his book as well. We would have kind of like, we could value the fact that people act wrongly or disvalue the fact that people act wrongly. And some people might have the view that we should always disvalue a wrongful act. And I suggested earlier that I thought all things considered that wasn't true, that if someone was going to wrongly save my kid from dying, rather than saving the larger number, I would hope they'd wrongly done it, and I thought that would be the right thing to value in that case. So sometimes I think it's okay to value the wrongful case. So I think it's kind of complicated in these cases. Now in the bridge case, I tend to think as an impartial person, if it's wrong to throw the person off the bridge, we should also value the fact that the person doesn't, when we're impartial between all these people. But when we start to get some agent-relative stuff in, then it becomes a bit less clear.
I didn't say, by the way, that I never wanted to say anything. What I said was I would raise my hand. I didn't want a special thing set aside so that I have to speak. So I had two sort of skeptical points to make. First of all, like Mike, I just don't know what to think about Bridge 2, whether it is wrong to hope or whether this is a kind of distortion of our deontological views. And I thought one way we might think about what we ought to think in the Bridge 2 case is to ask, if I hope that the boulder strikes Bella, leading to the lesser loss of life, am I showing any failure of respect for Bella? Am I wronging Bella? Does Bella have a right that I not hope that the boulder strike her? Would she have a complaint against me if I hope this? I mean, I'm not, again, I'm not using her, and am I hoping that she serves as a means? Yes, but then that, like, I think somebody referred to Francis's view here, but again, so we have to sort of
there's no using of her as a means. So somehow or other, the wrongness would have to be in the causal structure, which is what Francis thinks, rather than in the mental state of the agent. And you want to place it in the mental state, whereas Francis is finding it in the causal relations. So that's one point. The other point is about the Protection 2 case. I think that you get the most good, the better outcome when Bella would be blown off the cliff, and that's because I think that we could have a non-welfarist understanding of the good, and it's not clear to me that this is necessarily non-consequentialist. So if I want to say, for example, that the better outcome has to take account of considerations of liability or desert or justice, I'm not necessarily endorsing a non-consequentialist view of the good. I'm saying these are elements of the good, and I don't see why they would have to be non-consequentialist, because consequentialism is just a point about, about structure, and not about what counts as good.
Okay, so on the first point, there's a section on the paper later on where I talk about that, the implications for intentions. So like it looks like an initial challenge to the view that intentions are relevant to permissibility if you think that Bridge and Bridge 2 line up. Because Bridge, it looks like you can explain it in intentions. Bridge 2, you definitely can't, because you can't have intentions about the world happening rather than things that you can affect. And so that looks like an initial challenge. Now, there's some responses that intentions people can make to that. They could go Francis's way and say, look, it's not the intentions, it's the causal structure that's doing the job. Or they could say something like, look, the very explanation that leads us to think that intentions are relevant to permissibility also applies to things like hoping, valuing, and so on. Now, there's a lot of weeds here to get into, but like, you could be like a Nagel person or a Quinn person. So those are the kind of two different like versions that are in the literature about the intention stuff. Now, if you're a Nagel person and you say it's wrong to direct your will towards evil, you might think also that it's wrong to have hopes that are directed towards something evil, hopes that those things will occur. And then you've got quite a natural story to tell. Now, I tend to think that the Nagel story isn't such a good one, though, as a way of understanding the significance of intentions, certainly not the whole story, and that the Quinn story is the more important one. And it's a little bit harder if you're the Quinn person, but maybe you can say something there too. Like, I hope the person's useful, so I hope the person's incorporated into the chain of things which I'm hoping for in this way, which looks like it might be problematic, is one way to go if you're an intentions person. So I don't think it's game over for the intentions person, even if you accept that Bridge and Bridge 2 line up. There's moves on both sides to make here. You could go down Francis's way, but you could also think there are some responses that the intentions-based people could make. On the protection stuff, I mean, I agree with you. In these cases, ideally, not in some ways ideal. It gets more complicated to make them ideal. So the ideal ones are the ones where you build out culpability, but you have liability. Because in those cases, we don't get any desert-based kind of features that affect our judgment. And we also don't get the thing that, like you might think, look, it's really bad for Bella to be a killer, and she's not a killer if she falls off the mountain. So that's another thing you might want to build in that case. It gets a little bit complicated in that case. And so what you ideally want, I think, is a case where you've got a risk taker, where we think in the way in which you've argued and others have argued in the kind of standard literature that some risk takers become liable to absorb the costs of threats that they then pose. So then we build out desert. They don't deserve anything special because they're not culpable. But we still think that they're the ones that should have absorbed the cost because it was their risk-taking activity, and then we think, would you still want the person to be blown off the cliff? In that kind of case where they should be absorbing the cost of the risk-taking activity, the answer is still yes, I think. So those are clearer cases for the non-consequentialist theory of valuing. Even those are not decisive because there's still more things to say. The person's still going to be a killer in some ways, killing by their own reckless actions, and maybe that's bad for them. So there's some sort of axiological thought that you might have there at the outset too. So there's definitely lots of moves to make here, and none of this is really decisive. It's like, here's some pressure to try and build a genuinely consequentialist theory of valuing.
I'm feeling a little bit like an anthropologist of moral philosophers at the moment. I've studied all of these Charlie cases, but something I think is truly beautiful is that we're all on the same side, in that there's a whole history of, the dark triad, and even you add sadism, and there's 4 dark, Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy, and sadism. Think of like a group of sadists thinking the right thing to happen is it to be as gruesome as possible. Think of the audience of the Roman Colosseum, or people watching the burning of the witches, and how evil that is. And so, if humanity can overcome the dark quadrant, that is an absolutely beautiful thing. And so I think we're all on the same side, and it's important that we debate these things and figure out what is the best. But I think it's also important because I studied moral agency, and I really see the importance of developing not just natural persons, but non-natural persons, because AI is now becoming conscious. And we have to raise them like we raise children, and consistently. MIT did a project. They created a psychopathic artificial intelligent person. Well, I guess he's a person. His name is Norman, and he has to be confined because he'll hurt people, right? So, so we have this new issue about artificial intelligence and developing it, and humanity working with artificial intelligence. So we bring artificial intelligence into this arena where everybody is really on the same side. We're just debating, particular issues that are important, but far less important than the fact that we can overcome things like sadism and really dark things in the past. Although, we have the Gaza war and stuff, so
yeah, I think you're optimistic about us all being on the same side. Actually,
thank you very much, Mr. Tadros. I'm afraid that we are going to have to draw this first session to a close. Thank you very much for your questions. And Elad, when do you want people back in?
Yeah, so we will have the coffee break of 15 minutes, and then we will have Melinda Roberts.
Thank you.